The draft is 5230 just over the ceiling. Here's the tightened version holding the hook and ending intact and trimming redundancy through the middle. It lands at ~4 990 words. A shoulder slammed into a frozen door. It didn't move. The old man hit it again, harder, and pain shot up his arm. Snow drove sideways into his face. Behind him, a woman clutched a suitcase with both hands, shaking. A dog barked once into the wind. He backed up 3 steps and threw his whole body at the door. The lock gave. The door swung inward and he stumbled into the dark, landing hard on his knees. Cold air, dust, silence. He pushed himself up, breathing like a man half his age, and turned to pull his wife inside. This was Silas Hartwell, 72 years old, and 6 hours ago a bank had taken everything he owned. He had nowhere left to go but this dead railroad station. What that old dog found behind a second iron door would change all of it. Stay with me on this one. Let me back up and tell you how they got here because it matters. That morning, Silas and Odette Hartwell still had a home. A farmhouse out past the edge of the Bitterroot Valley, white paint peeling, a porch that sagged on one side. They'd lived there 41 years. Silas built the barn out back with his own 2 hands. Odette planted the lilacs by the gate. Their boy learned to walk on that porch. Every board in that place knew their names. But here's the thing about a farmhouse when you're old and the money's gone. It doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to the bank. Silas had worked the railroad his whole life, 44 years. He started as a boy swinging a lantern in the yard and ended up a section foreman, the man who kept the tracks safe for 100 miles of the Northern Line. Good work, honest work. But the pension wasn't much, and when the line cut back its runs, the checks got smaller, and then one winter they stopped coming clean at all. 2 years back, Odette got sick. Her lungs. The doctor wanted money up front, and Silas did what a man does. He borrowed against the farm, telling himself he'd pay it back come the good years. But at 72, the good years don't come. They just don't. That morning, the man from the bank drove out in a clean gray car. He wore a wool coat and rubber overshoes so the mud wouldn't touch him. He stood on the sagging porch and wouldn't come inside, wouldn't take the coffee Odette offered. He just held out a paper. "You've got until noon, Mr. Hartwell," he said. "I'm sorry, it's out of my hands." Now Silas Hartwell was not a man who begged. In 44 years on the railroad, he'd faced down runaway cars and prairie fires and men twice his size, and he never once begged. But he came close that morning. He said, "My wife's not well. There's a storm coming. Give us a week." The man looked at his shoes. "I can't," he said, and that was that. By 11, a sheriff's deputy was parked at the end of the drive waiting, not unkind, just doing his job. Silas and Odette packed what they could carry. 1 suitcase, a cardboard box tied with twine, Odette's mother's quilt, a photograph of their son in his army uniform, the boy they'd lost at a place called Anzio, a name that meant nothing to anyone but them and meant everything. They left the lilacs. They left the barn. They left 41 years standing empty in the snow, and they had no car. The truck had died in October and there was no money to fix it, so they walked. An old man, an old woman, and an old dog out on the county road with the sky going the color of iron. The dog's name was Biscuit. A shepherd, gray around the muzzle now, 12 years old, which for a big dog is ancient. Silas had found him as a pup half frozen in a ditch and warmed him inside his coat, and Biscuit had never once left his side since. Where Silas walked, Biscuit walked. That was the whole arrangement, and both of them were fine with it. They headed for town, 12 miles, but they hadn't gone 3 before the storm came down off the mountains, and this was no ordinary storm. This was a Montana blizzard, the kind that turns the world white and swallows the road and drops the cold down so hard it burns. The wind came screaming across the valley, and Odette started to cough. That deep, wet cough that scared Silas more than any bank ever could. They were going to die out there. He knew it. He'd walked these roads his whole life, and he knew exactly what this cold could do to two old people caught in the open. That's when Biscuit stopped. The dog planted his feet and turned off the road, nose up, and barked back at them through the snow. Silas almost called him back, but something in the way the dog stood there, sure of himself, made the old man look where the dog was looking. And there, maybe 200 yards off through the white, was a black shape, a building. Silas knew it the second he saw the outline. Fenwick Junction, an old depot from the early days of the line, shut down and boarded up more than 30 years ago when they rerouted the track through the pass. A dead station in the middle of nowhere. He'd worked past it 100 times as a young man, and never once gone inside. "Odette," he shouted over the wind, "this way, follow the dog." And that's how they came to that frozen door. That's the door I told you about. That's where we started. So now you know how Silas Hartwell ended up on his knees in the dark, 72 years old, everything he owned in one suitcase with a storm at his back. Inside it was black as a mine, but it was still. The wind couldn't reach them here, and after that road the stillness felt like a gift. Silas got to his feet and helped Odette in, and Biscuit trotted past both of them into the dark like he owned the place. Silas had matches in his coat pocket, the waxed kind, kept dry. He struck one. The little flame showed him a room he half remembered. The old waiting room. A long bench along one wall. A ticket window with the glass cracked. And there in the corner, a potbelly stove, rusted red-brown but whole. "There's a stove," he said. "Odette, sit down and breathe. I'll get us warm." He found a broken chair, a stack of old timetables gone soft with damp, and near the back wall a pile of split wood some long-gone station master had never burned. Silas built a fire the way he'd built 10,000 fires, quick and clean, and in a few minutes the stove was ticking and glowing and pushing real heat into that dead little room. Odette held her hands out to it and closed her eyes. The color came back to her face. Biscuit lay down between them with a groan the way old dogs do and put his chin on his paws. And for just a moment, it was almost all right. They were alive. They were warm. They had each other. Whatever tomorrow was, it could wait. But Biscuit wouldn't settle. The dog got up. He walked to the back of the room, to a doorway that led deeper into the building, and he stood there staring into the dark. Then he looked back at Silas. Then he whined. "Lie down, boy," Silas said. "We're staying put." Biscuit didn't lie down. He walked through the doorway and disappeared, and a second later Silas heard it, scratching. The dog was scratching at something and whining, and then he barked, sharp and insistent, the bark that meant come here now. Now here's the thing. Silas had known that dog 12 years, and in 12 years Biscuit had barked like that exactly twice. Once when a rattlesnake was under the porch steps where a boy was about to reach. And once when the barn caught a spark and the whole thing could have gone up with the horses inside. Twice. And both times that bark meant something. So Silas got up. He lit another match and followed the dog into the back. The doorway led into the freight room. Bigger than the waiting room, colder, with a high ceiling and a loading platform along one side where the boxcars used to pull up. Empty now. Just dust and old crates and pigeon nests up in the rafters. And along the far wall a door. Not a wooden door like the others. This one was iron. Heavy plate iron, painted over black, set into the brick with a frame of riveted steel. There was a hasp across it and a padlock the size of a man's fist, rusted solid. And stenciled across the iron in white paint gone gray with age were the words, "Northern Pacific Bullion Transfer, Authorized Personnel Only." Biscuit sat in front of that door and looked up at Silas and thumped his tail once against the floor. Silas stared at those words a long time. Now Silas Hartwell knew the railroad, knew it better than any man alive in that valley, and he knew what a bullion transfer vault was. In the old days, before the banks got big, before the roads got good, the railroad moved the money of the whole territory. Gold from the mines, silver, payroll for 100 camps. And when a storm shut the line down, or a shipment couldn't move on schedule, they'd lock it in a transfer vault at a junction depot and post a guard until the track cleared. But Fenwick Junction had been dead for 30 years. Nobody had guarded anything here in a generation. Silas told himself it was empty, had to be empty. When they shut a line down, they moved everything out first. That was the rule. He'd helped decommission depots himself. You emptied the vault, you signed the ledger, you welded the door. But this door wasn't welded. It was locked and forgotten. He put his hand flat against the cold iron, and Biscuit whined again, low, and pawed at the base of the door. "Easy, boy," Silas said, but his voice came out strange. "Easy, it's nothing, it's empty. It's got to be empty." He went back to the fire. He sat down next to Odette and didn't say a word about the door, because there was no sense filling her head with a fool's dream on a night like this. He told himself he'd forget about it. They'd wait out the storm and walk on to town in the morning, and that iron door was none of their business. He almost believed it. The fire ticked. Odette breathed easy. Biscuit finally came back and lay down. Outside, the wind howled and the snow piled against the walls, and inside it was warm and quiet and still. For about an hour, everything was calm. Then Biscuit lifted his head off the floor. His ears went up. A growl started low in his chest, and Silas felt the hair stand up on his own neck before he even knew why. Somewhere out in the storm, an engine. Silas got to the window and rubbed a hole in the frost. 2 headlights were coming up the old freight road toward the depot. Slow, careful, but coming. And a depot that had been dead for 30 years does not get visitors at night in a blizzard. Not by accident. Whoever those headlights belonged to, they were coming here. And they weren't lost. The truck stopped about 40 yards out. The headlights cut off. And for a minute nothing happened, and Silas stood at that frosted window with his heart going hard, watching. Then 2 doors opened, and 2 men climbed down into the snow, and even at that distance Silas could see one of them was carrying something long across his arm. A rifle. Odette was awake now, sitting up. "Silas, what is it?" "Company," he said quietly. "Get back from the fire, into the corner, take the dog." He didn't know who they were. But he was starting to have a very bad guess, and I'll tell you what it was, because Silas figured it out standing right there at that window. There is only one reason 2 men drive out to a forgotten depot in the middle of a blizzard. They came for what was behind that iron door. They knew it was there. They'd known, maybe for a long time, and they'd been waiting for a night exactly like this one. A night when nobody in the world would see them come, and nobody would hear anything over the storm, and if the snow buried their tracks by morning, so much the better. They hadn't counted on the fire, but now they could see it, glowing orange through the frosted glass, and there was no hiding it. The taller man stopped in the snow and pointed at the window. Silas watched him say something to the other. Then they came on, fast now, straight for the door. And just like that, the whole nature of that night changed. An hour ago, Silas Hartwell was an evicted old man trying to survive a storm. Now he was standing between 2 armed strangers and something they'd driven through a blizzard to steal, and he and his sick wife were the only witnesses. The door banged open, and the cold came roaring in with the 2 of them. The tall one came first. Younger, maybe 40, with a hard, flat face and snow melting on his shoulders. The rifle was up, not quite pointed, but up. Behind him came the second man, older, heavier, with small, quick eyes that went straight past Silas and Odette to the doorway at the back of the room. To the freight room. To the vault. "Well," the older one said, "this is a surprise." Silas stepped in front of Odette. "We're just waiting out the storm," he said, keeping his voice level. Got put out of our home today. Will be gone by morning. We don't want any trouble and we haven't seen a thing." The older man smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "You haven't seen a thing," he repeated. "No, I don't suppose you have." He looked at the tall one. "Check the back, Dell." The tall one walked past them, boots loud on the plank floor, and went into the freight room. Silas heard him stop, heard a long silence. Then the tall one came back out grinning. "Padlock's still on it," he said. "Nobody's touched it. It's all still in there." And here's where I have to tell you something Silas didn't know yet but was about to find out. These two weren't just thieves who'd stumbled on a lucky rumor. The older one, the one with the small eyes, his name was Vernon Cale, and 30 years ago Vernon Cale's father had been the last station master at Fenwick Junction. The very man who was supposed to empty that vault when they shut the line down. And Vernon's father hadn't emptied it. He'd found the paperwork was a mess. The line was closing in a hurry. The bullion shipment logged as already moved when it hadn't been. So he'd locked it and said nothing, planning to come back. And then he died before he ever could, with the secret half told to a boy who never forgot it. Vernon had spent 30 years working up the nerve and the plan, waiting for a night like this. And now, on the one night in 30 years he finally came for it, he'd found 2 old people and a dog sitting by a fire 20 feet from the door. "How much is in there?" Silas asked. He didn't know why he asked, he just did. Vernon looked at him a long moment, deciding something. Then he said, almost proud, "Gold and silver bullion, old man, territorial payroll that never got moved. My daddy told me what the manifest said before he passed." He paused. "In your money today, somewhere near $280 million. The number just hung there in that cold room. $280 million. 20 feet away, behind a padlock, in a station everyone had forgotten." And Silas Hartwell, who had walked out of his own home that morning with everything he owned in one suitcase, stood there and understood exactly why these men could never let him and Odette walk out of here alive. Because $280 million has no witnesses. That's the rule. That's how it works. I want to stop right here for 1 second, because if you've made it this far, you already know this isn't just some story about a locked door. It's about what 2 desperate old people do when the whole world has already decided they don't matter. If that's the kind of story you came for, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because it's about to turn. Now let's get back to that cold room. "Dell," Vernon said, "get the cutting torch from the truck. And bring the shovel." He looked at Silas when he said the word shovel, and he made sure Silas understood. Dell went back out into the storm, and now it was just Vernon Cale and the rifle and 2 old people and a dog. Vernon set the rifle against the ticket window, casual, because what could an old man do? And he pulled a flask from his coat and took a drink and looked at the fire like a man who had all the time in the world. "Nothing personal," he said. "You understand. I've waited 30 years for this night. 30 years. You think I'm going to let it get away because 2 hobos wandered in out of the cold?" Silas said nothing, but his eyes were moving. And I'll tell you what they were moving over, because Silas Hartwell had spent 44 years on the railroad, and there wasn't much about that vault or that building he didn't understand better than these 2 men ever could. He was looking at the stove. More exactly, at the long iron poker leaning against it, the one he'd used to bank the fire. And he was looking at Biscuit, who was on his feet now, low to the floor, that growl still rolling in his chest, his eyes locked on Vernon Cale and never leaving him. And he was doing the arithmetic an old man does when there's no good option left and only a bad one. Because here's the thing Silas understood that Vernon didn't. The second Dell came back with that torch, it was over. 2 men, 1 rifle, 1 shovel meant for 2 graves in the snow. Their only chance, the only one, was the minute they had right now, while it was just Vernon and the flask and his guard down. "You mind if my wife sits closer to the fire?" Silas said quietly. "She's sick, her lungs. It won't matter to you in an hour anyhow." Vernon shrugged. "Sure, warm her up." He almost laughed at his own joke. Silas moved to help Odette, and that put him a step nearer the stove, near the poker, and he bent down like he was fixing the quilt around her shoulders, and under his breath, so low it was almost nothing, he said one word to the dog. He said, "Watch." That was the word, the old command from the barn from 12 years back. Watch meant the dog fixed on a target and did not let go. Biscuit's whole body went still. Then two things happened at the same instant, and they happened fast. The door banged open and Dell came back in with the torch tank on his shoulder, and for half a second both men's eyes went to him. And in that half second, Silas Hartwell grabbed the iron poker off the stove and drove it, glowing hot on the end, straight into the back of Vernon Cale's leg. Vernon screamed and went down, and Silas shouted, "Biscuit, take him." The dog left the floor like something 20 years younger. 70 pounds of shepherd hit Dell in the chest just as he cleared the doorway, and Dell went over backward with the torch tank clanging away across the planks, and the dog's jaws locked on his forearm. Dell was screaming and swinging, and Biscuit would not let go, tearing at him, driving him back toward the open door and the storm. Vernon was on the floor grabbing for the rifle by the window. Silas saw it. Silas was 72 years old, and his knees were shot and his back was worse, but he had been a section foreman, and a section foreman does not freeze. He brought the poker down across Vernon's reaching arm and heard something break, and Vernon howled and rolled away from the gun. Silas grabbed the rifle up off the floor, and the whole room stopped. Silas Hartwell stood there with the rifle up and level, and 44 years fell away, because a railroad man in that country learned to shoot young, and Silas had never forgotten how. He put the barrel on Vernon Cale. "Biscuit," he called out steady, "hold." By the door, the dog let go of Dell's arm and stood over him, snarling, teeth bared, ready to go again at one word. Dell lay in the snow blowing through the open door, clutching his torn arm, and he did not move. "Now," Silas said, and his voice filled that cold room, "here's how the rest of this night is going to go." Vernon was on the floor holding his broken arm, his burned leg twisted under him, and all the smug was gone out of his face. "You're an old man," he said through his teeth. "You can't hold a gun all night. Come morning you'll be asleep, and I won't be asleep," Silas said. "I've stayed awake through worse nights than you'll ever see. 44 years of them." He nodded at Odette. "My wife's going to feed the stove, and you two are going to lie right there where I can see you, and we are all going to wait for this storm to break. And when it does, and the county plow comes up that road like it does every clear morning, I am going to flag it down. And you are going to explain to the deputy riding on it exactly what you drove out here to do." "You don't understand," Vernon spat. "That's my money, my daddy." "Your daddy stole it," Silas said, "and it isn't money. It's railroad bullion, government payroll, and it belongs to the people it was owed to 100 years ago, or to the state now, and either way it is not yours, and it is surely not mine." He shook his head slowly. "I don't want your gold, Cale. I never did. I just wanted to get my wife through the night. You're the one who turned it into this." And that was the truth. That was the whole truth of Silas Hartwell. Even standing there with $280 million 20 feet behind him and a rifle in his hands, the thought of taking it never once crossed his mind. It wasn't his. And a man who will walk out of his own home rather than cheat the bank is not a man who will steal from anybody, not for any number you can name. So that's how they spent the night. An old man in a chair with a rifle across his knees and a dog at his feet that never once closed its eyes. An old woman feeding a fire and coughing into her quilt but sitting up straight and unafraid, because 41 years with Silas Hartwell had taught her that when that man said he'd get you through the night, he got you through the night. And two thieves on the floor by the wall, one with a broken arm and a burned leg, one with a chewed-up forearm, both of them out of moves. The wind died down toward dawn. It always does. And when the first gray light came up in the frosted windows, Silas heard the sound he'd been waiting for. The low grind of a diesel and the scrape of a steel blade on a county road. The morning plow. He had Odette open the front door, and when the plow came even with the depot, Silas Hartwell stepped out into the snow with the rifle held up over his head so the driver could see it wasn't pointed at anybody, and he waved that plow down. There was a sheriff's deputy riding along, the way there often was after a big storm. The same young deputy, as it happened, who'd sat at the end of the Hartwell drive the day before. He climbed down into the snow with his hand on his holster and his mouth open. "Mr. Hartwell," he said, "what in the world?" "Deputy," Silas said, "there's two men inside I need you to take into custody. And there's a door in the back of this station you're going to want the state to have a look at. There's about $280 million behind it that's been sitting here lost for 30 years. The deputy looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Then he went inside and saw Vernon Cale and Dell on the floor and the iron door with the railroad bullion stencil on it, and he stopped looking at Silas like that. Now I'll tell you how it all came out, because the storm broke that morning, but the story didn't end there. The state came. Of course they came. Men in overcoats, men with clipboards, men from the railroad's old holding company, and men from the government who argued for the better part of a year about who that gold and silver belonged to. And when they finally cut that iron door open, everything Vernon Cale's father had logged as moved 30 years ago was still sitting inside, stacked and waiting. Territorial bullion. The number in the papers ran to $280 million, and some said more. Vernon Cale went to prison and Dell with him. Turned out they'd already done harm to a night watchman at another depot years back, chasing the same rumor, and it all came out at the trial. Silas testified. Odette testified. The dog, they said in the county paper, was the only witness who couldn't be cross-examined. But here's the part that matters. Here's the part I brought you all this way to hear. The state does not simply keep found treasure and say thank you to the man who saved it. There are laws about such things, old ones, about a citizen who recovers stolen public property and delivers it whole to the authorities. It took the lawyers a year to sort it. But when it was done, the state of Montana awarded Silas Hartwell a finder's portion. Not $280 million. Nothing like it, but enough. More than enough. A sum a retired railroad man and his wife could not have spent in 10 lifetimes. The first thing Silas did, the very first, was drive to that bank and pay off the loan on the farmhouse in full, in cash, and buy it back outright. The man in the wool coat couldn't look him in the eye. They moved back into the white farmhouse with the sagging porch and the lilacs by the gate. Silas fixed the porch. He fixed the barn. And on the first warm evening of that spring, he sat out on that porch he'd built with his own hands, 41 years his and now his again, with Odette beside him and her cough all but gone, because now there was money for every doctor in the state. And Biscuit lay at his feet. The old dog didn't have long. 12 going on 13 is a full life for a shepherd, and everyone knew it, and nobody said it out loud. But he had that spring, and that summer in the sun on the porch, fed on the best of everything, honored in a county newspaper he couldn't read, the dog who scratched at a forgotten door and would not lie down when he was told. Silas used to say in the years after that people had it backwards. They'd say the Hartwells got lucky. They'd say the dog found a fortune, and Silas would shake his head. The dog didn't find a fortune, he'd say. The dog found us shelter. The fortune was an accident. What that dog did was refuse to let two old people freeze and then refuse to let two men do us harm. The money's just money. I gave most of it away before I died anyhow. And he did, to the Railroad Widows Fund, to the county hospital, to a home for old working dogs he built and named after nobody, because Biscuit would have been embarrassed. Think back to that first door. An old man, 72 years old, throwing his whole broken body against frozen iron because his wife would die if he didn't get it open. That's where we started. A man with nothing, refusing to quit. That's the whole story, right there. The vault, the gold, the 280 million, that was never really the point. The point was a man who wouldn't stop pushing on a locked door, a woman who wasn't afraid because she knew her husband, and an old gray dog who, when it counted most on the coldest night of all their lives, simply would not lie down. Silas Hartwell died at 81 in the farmhouse in his own bed, with Odette holding his hand. And they say that right up to the end, whenever a door stuck in that old house, he'd put his shoulder to it and smile. Because he knew. Some doors are worth breaking down. You just never know until you're on your knees in the dark what's waiting on the other side.